Hello, everyone, and welcome to Education in Focus, powered by Chalkboard News. I'm Dan McCaleb, Vice President of News and Content at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of ChalkboardNews.com. Chalkboard is a news website dedicated to issues related to K-12 education across the country. Joining me again today is Brendan Clary, Chalkboard's K-12 editor. How are you, Brendan?
I'm doing well, Dan. How about yourself?
I am doing well, thank you. We are recording this on Monday, October 2nd. Brendan, since the COVID-19 pandemic, there have been significant concerns about learning loss related to remote learning. Even though we're years beyond the pandemic, many states still utilize virtual learning under very certain specific circumstances, including on credit recovery and credit advancement courses. Credit recovery courses allow students to retake classes that they previously failed, allowing them to graduate on time. Credit advancement is more like a normal course of study where students, did not initially fail the course. They're just taking something above and beyond their regular classroom work. But there's an emerging concern that students who are able to take these courses and tests remotely are easily able to cheat and, at least in some instances, are in fact cheating. Tell us more about this story, Brendan, that you've written about at chalkboardnews.com.
Yeah, Dan. So what you mentioned, there's differences between the credit recovery and the credit advancement. But one teacher in the metro Atlanta area, he basically said in a video earlier this year, and also later he published an op-ed in with the Fordham Institute, which is like a think tank. And he basically said, look, I had these students in my class as a former public school teacher. I had these students in my class, and they were able to, and he says, I could see that they were going through these credit recovery classes very quickly at home and had an extensive sort of documentation process about how they were able to go through, for example, like a 33-question algebra test in 18 minutes while getting a 97%, which would mean, you're looking at a question for half a minute or less and, completing the entire math course in about 15 hours. And, a regular school year for a class is, 152 hours if you get 1 hour a day for, the whole school year. So that's sort of the concern there is, are students able to go through these tests or these courses very quickly by, using workaround methods, basically copying and pasting or just moving very, very quickly. The school district said this is not a problem. They told the teacher that. His name is Jeremy Noonan. So they told Noonan, this is, we're going to keep doing the virtual credit recovery stuff. Like, this helps our students graduate. But they say they have, safeguards in place to make sure that students are not doing that. And that's what the Edmentum, the courseware provider, says as well, is that there are some guide rails in place and ways to monitor students. And from what I understand, there is a way to tell when students took a test, like at what time of the day and how long it took them to do that. There's also, there are programs out there that allow teachers to see what is on a student's screen, but it's not always clear like how much of that was being utilized in these situations or in a lot of different schools around the country. So that's sort of the inciting incident. And then after that, I was able to look around and see, there's a lot of different school districts that are using this. There's the company Edmentum. They sent over that they work with 6,200, I believe, public schools in the country across the nation, all 50 states. And I believe that is specifically with the credit recovery. But they also have a lot of, credit advancement options. So there's a lot of online learning that's going on, as you mentioned, after the pandemic. And so this is an easy option for schools to implement because, it can be at home or it can be in a computer lab, and you can have 30 or 40 students in a computer lab and one teacher sort of overseeing and making sure that, nobody's like going out of control. But that also, as some researchers I've talked to have pointed out, that also means you have 30 or 40 students in a computer lab and they can kind of get up to a lot in that sort of context, and that there are questions about how much learning is actually happening in those scenarios. And other concerns are, I talked to a Vanderbilt University professor. Her name is Caroline Heinrich, and she told me that she is concerned from a equity standpoint of if you take the worst performing students out of their traditional classes and put them in credit recovery classes, which do not do as well of a job. And then she supports that with her research that they don't do as well of a job.
Don't do as well of a job in teaching.
Yes, yeah. So the academic achievement's not the same there, or the academic outcomes aren't the same there, as a traditional classroom or their peers who were in a traditional classroom. That you're sort of penalizing them for low academic achievement in the first place, and she's concerned about that. So that's sort of the there's some critics who have said we should not be doing this, but on the other side, administrators are. They're strapped for cash. They're strapped for teachers. We've heard a lot about the teacher shortage. There's a lot of different challenges that the pandemic brought up. And so it's sort of, there is a little bit more flexibility, and maybe parents expect more flexibility. Maybe students expect more flexibility. And so this is sort of touted as one of those options. But I think then the question becomes, like, is this the way that we want to educate students who are maybe struggling? What are the ramifications of that? And are students able to cheat on that and on these kinds of assessments? And so it's pretty clear from what I've seen that it is possible to do that. I mean, even the Paulding County schools where Noonan was employed before he resigned, they say they have these guardrails in place, but they also, in a brochure, they say participants are expected to perform all work on their own, and Googling answers is not acceptable. So they kind of acknowledge, I think, in that way that students can do this, but they tell them not to do that, and so it's sort of an interesting back and forth between the critics and the advocates of this.
So we published 2 of your stories at chalkboardnews.com on this issue, but you're working on a series of stories. If you could just very briefly, Brendan, because we're almost out of time, tell us what's coming next.
Yeah, so the third part is, as I mentioned, a conversation with Caroline Heinrich and kind of getting into the deep dive of the research. What is it, like more broadly, is online credit recovery harmful to students? Is it helpful to them? And looking at her work and, sort of an interview with her and some of her co-authors as well, just getting into that and seeing what does the data say about educational outcomes regarding that. And then, looking forward as, the next piece, I think what's going to happen in the future with, about Edmentum, about these different, providers trying to do a more forward-looking thing. But it's also another interesting aspect is, what about these, websites that students can go to find answers when they're copying and pasting? Is there a vested interest there for students to cheat? And that's an interesting question that I'd like to look into as well, of does cheating play a role in the success of some companies? And I think that's a very interesting question. What kinds of, monetization is that out there? Is that out there, and is that ethical, right? And so I think it's a very complex and moving thing, because you want to be able to help students with their homework, but then how far does that go, right? And that's sort of I think a big and interesting question.
Thank you for that, Brendan. Listeners can read the 2 stories that have already published at chalkboardnews.com and be on the lookout this week for further reporting on the topic, but we are out of time. For Brendan Clary, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe, and thank you for listening.